Hi everyone. Good evening, good morning, good day, wherever, whichever part of the world you're in. I am Vikram Shah. I'm the CEO and founder of Vikram Shah Consulting, a full-time MBA admissions consulting company that helps the clients fulfill their dreams, get into their dream schools, uh, accelerate their careers, and we've been doing this full-time since 2009, right? So we're dedicated MBA consultants, focus only on this. And beyond MBA consulting as well, we specialize in master's applications, undergrad applications as well. Um, Today's session is mostly inclined towards MBA applications because this is an MBA event as well. And what I try to do is try to preempt most of the questions that candidates would have. So I'm going to talk about a various number of things, and these are the topics I've selected for today. One is just getting some of the things out of the way, right? To help you figure out what are the average GMAT score top MBA programs, what are the sort of strategies that you should have if you fall in any of these categories. Um, if you are considering applying with round one versus round two, or applying with the GMAT waiver, and other factors. And is there any questions that are missing from here? Please just put them in the chat, and I will try and answer uh, some of these. So I can already see some questions in the chat. And yes, I'll try and answer some of these through the presentation itself. So let me first talk about the average GMAT score at top MBA programs. So just to put things in perspective, the lowest GMAT score for an Indian male at an NYU or a Darden is a 740, right? So that is the lowest. If you're at 730 and you're an Indian male, you're already going to be somewhat compromised. And we would encourage you to try and up your score. Or if you're applying with a slightly subpar score, then consider using some of the strategies we're going to come to. The average GMAT score, most of the top schools in general, is about a 730. But most Indians and Chinese tend to apply with higher GMAT scores, something to keep in mind, right? But as far as you're close to the average, that's more or less fine. Now let's talk specifically about application strategies, and this is specifically targeted towards different audiences. Now I'm going to talk about reapplicants first. And I think last year was a pretty challenging year, especially in round two. There were a lot of people who applied but didn't convert. And I think partly that's because the number of applications went up by about 30 to 40% at some of the top schools. Not everywhere, but at some of the top schools. And that's also primarily because there were a lot of layoffs last year in the US. So some of the demographics have really got affected. So the first thing I would tell a reapplicant is get your last year's applications reviewed. Just because you've not made it doesn't mean that something was wrong with your application, but there could be. Also go back and reassess your career goals and stories. But again, last year was particularly challenging. So there is a possibility there's absolutely nothing wrong with your application. Maybe it was just timing. Maybe it was just the sheer number of the competition for limited number of seats. So as a reapplicant, the first thing is reassess and then look at strengthening your candidacy. So to strengthen the candidacy, what can you do? Obviously, you can improve your test scores. You definitely need to demonstrate professional growth between last year and this year. You may want to show more leadership experience, either professionally or in the community. And leadership experience doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in a formal leadership role. It can be taking initiative. It could be leading a particular project, leading from behind within a team, etc. So a number of things that you could have done. Right now, you may also have updated schools, especially if you put on the wait list through some of these, but don't worry about that. As a reapplicant, you will be applying fresh, so consider your application from the time that you applied last year and build on those stories. So yeah, one thing that you must do is definitely as a reapplicant, apply in round one and apply to at least 50% of your schools in round one. Apply to at least 50% new schools in round one. So you do not want to be a reapplicant on every school. There's a possibility you may have done certain damage as well, and some of the damage might be difficult to overcome. So if you're a reapplicant, identify which schools you want to reapply to, maybe reapply to all, but definitely apply to a new bunch of schools, and at least 50% of your applications should be to a new bunch of schools. Now, for some of the candidates who are younger, and when I talk about younger, I'm talking anyone with 0 to 3 years experience. And I think the first question you need to ask yourself is, are you willing to wait another year, or must you go to school this year? If you're willing to wait another year and spend time building your profile, etc., then you do not need to have a safe school. Only apply to your dream schools, your target schools. Do not have a safe school, but make sure you're not exhausting your entire list of schools by applying to each and every one, right? Because if you're applying the following year as well, you may want to strengthen your candidacy. So you may want to have some options for fresh applications the next year. Also, target schools which have a high percentage of younger candidates applying. So if you see Harvard, Stanford tend to have a lot of younger candidates applying compared to a Columbia or a Booth. So select your schools wisely. Some schools offer deferred admissions as well, and consider applying to those. If you're a younger candidate who must go and you're not willing to wait, then you must, if I were you, I would definitely apply to one safe school in round one, perhaps two as well. But make sure you're applying to your target school and your dream schools, whether in round one, round two, and definitely cover your dream schools so that you don't have any regrets. What do I mean by that? You're going to do your MBA once in your life, right? So you don't want to say, hey, I got into this school, but perhaps I could have gone to something much more competitive as well. So make sure that you've exhausted your list as well. But select your schools smartly and wisely when you're applying. Now let's talk about the next target group, right? So as a younger candidate who's definitely must go abroad next year, just go all in. So safe schools, competitive schools, dream schools, have to apply to all. More experienced candidates. So I've interacted with a few more experienced candidates already. What I mean by more experienced candidates, the average number of years of experience most candidates bring to the table at the start of the MBA program is about 5. There are candidates with 8 years or more experience, and schools tend to look at them a little differently. So when I'm talking about more experienced candidates, we're not only talking about US schools, we're also talking about European and Asian schools as well. So I think especially when you're applying to US schools, I think schools have started looking and making life slightly more difficult for older candidates. You really need to build a case of why you need a 2-year MBA or over a 1-year MBA. So I think if you are applying, and even if you prefer applying to a 2-year MBA program, you need to have a couple of 1-year programs as part of your application strategy as well, if you must go abroad in the coming year. The other thing that you may want to consider is also applying to part-time programs in and around your country. I think as an older candidate, it's important to evaluate the opportunity cost of pursuing an MBA and see if it really makes sense. Sometimes you may get access to a great brand and it just might be close to you. I'll give you an example. So I had a candidate who had about 10 years experience, and he, for whatever reason, couldn't make it to the traditional MBA program. And he was on too high a salary for him to attend regular schools in India. He wanted sexy branding as well. And then there were so Chicago Booth had a program running in Hong Kong, and that kind of made sense. INSEAD had a program for experienced candidates to attend, again, a part-time program in Singapore, and that was another option as well. And this actually made a lot of sense. It still gave them access to a great network and still gave them access to great branding. So I think as an older candidate, you should consider this. If you are looking at applying to 2-year programs in the US, then look at schools which tend to prefer more experience. Okay. Strategies for clients applying with, or candidates applying with, less competitive test scores. Sorry for the error on the slide. I think the score was Everton. Apologize for that. So this first strategy I would use is, let's define what's a less competitive score. So if you're an Indian male applying to the top 20 schools and you have a score of about 730 on the GMAT or less, we're talking about the regular GMAT and not Focus, but you can always go on to the GMAT website and look at the conversion scores, and automatically you will get an indication for your scores more competitive or no. But if you are at a sub class average GMAT score, or then you may want to apply to some of these schools in early action. Some schools, at some schools like a Duke, early action is binding. Darden also had an option of binding and non-binding. The moment you go in the binding category, you're actually committing to the school, and it shows them that you're really interested in the program and actually improves your chances. And that's something really worth considering. Some schools also offer open interviews, which means that irrespective of your score, you will be guaranteed an interview. So Tuck has open interviews. Some schools like a UNC Keenan Flagler also had open interviews, which meant even before submitting an application, you can actually go on campus and interview. So this gives you a better chance of presenting your candidacy. Please note that this may actually require you to actually travel to the US and be on campus and interview. So you need to consider that as well. These options do change year on year, so you need to check what's available this year and then take a call. But it's definitely one of the strategies worth considering. And if someone's interviewing on campus, you're already telling a school that you're really, really interested in the program. So try and take advantage of these. Now, if I'm applying with a less competitive score, I definitely would want to have safe schools as part of my strategy in round one, rather than only applying to super ambitious schools. I think when you have a safe school, the only thing that you lose is the deposit early on. It also gives you a lot more confidence to apply to more competitive schools later. And I would say then after that, once you know you've applied to a school where you're happy going to, and it's going to do great for your career, then whatever schools you have to apply to after that is going to be anything more competitive. And that's when you can go crazy. So I had a candidate who had applied with a previous consultant before coming to me, and she exhausted some of the options as well. In round one, she wanted to play safe. We figured out where she was going wrong because she actually bombed a couple of interviews as well, but then give us enough time to take corrective action. And then round two, she went crazy. She applied to the most competitive schools, and she eventually made it to Stanford, right? So if you're applying with a less competitive score or chinks in your profile, that could be a good strategy to go with. Yes, sometimes it makes sense to apply to more schools in round one, but definitely apply to a safe school in round one. Do not leave your safe school for later. You might find yourself in a more stressful situation should you not make it to any school in round one. Now, when I say applying with a test waiver, and that's again a topic I'm going to talk about later, but let's say your GMAT or GRE scores are particularly low. What do I mean by that? You're in the range of about 307, 308. Then I think, and if you're trying to apply to schools which are significantly more competitive, or where the average GMAT score, GRE score significantly more, then you may want to apply without your current GRE GMAT score by actually applying for a test waiver. Now, for a test waiver, most schools require you to be have some prerequisites, maybe to show a lot of strength in quant, maybe a certain number of work experience, maybe you have CPA, CFA, etc. So you need to see if you're eligible for that. But we had a candidate this year who had a particularly low GMAT GRE score. She wanted to apply with that score. We strictly advise her not to. We wrote to a few schools. We applied for the test waiver. We got the test waiver. Then she got an admit, and we only focused on her strengths. She eventually got into schools with about a 50% scholarship. But that's the sort of strategy that we use, right? So the idea is if you have a really poor score, focus on your strengths and try to use certain things to your advantage. And like I said, if you're applying in round one, once you've gotten admitted to a safe school, then go crazy and apply to anything else after that, right? Okay. Now, if you're applying from an overrepresented group, what I mean by this, Indian male IT engineer. The challenge is for schools to differentiate you. And the challenge could be for you to also differentiate yourself. So in that case, you may want to apply as early as possible and apply in early action, commit to a school. The advantage of doing that is there are many more seats available than later. The other thing is also if you applied, say, in round two, and there are several people with a similar profile that have been admitted in round one, school doesn't need more of the same, technically, right? So you might find it more difficult to convert and get admitted to that particular school. So if you're from an overrepresented group, I would definitely recommend applying as early as possible and the earlier rounds, and especially in early action. Also make sure you're applying to safe schools early. So yes, this could mean again that, excuse me, that you may land up paying a little bit in deposit, but in the grander scheme of things, it makes more sense. Do not apply to schools which are very, very big on diversity. So again, what do I mean by that? For example, Berkeley has, they have classes of 240 students. They have about 40% international. So that's about 100 internationals and 50 countries represented. So technically, they are going to look at a lot of diversity. They're not going to have more than 8 to 10 Indians in a batch, perhaps even less. In some batches, there have been only 3. Uh, Imagine 50% women. So you're literally fighting for about 4 or 5 seats. And they may not go for someone with a very, very typical background. So those 4 and 5 candidates, you can imagine, will be fairly different. So if you're one of the overrepresented groups and you have a really strong case, definitely apply to one of those schools, sure. But if you do not have a very competitive profile, then perhaps skip schools like that. Instead, you'd rather apply to schools which have a larger class size. And irrespective of whichever schools you're applying to, make sure that you're getting access to your target recruiters, right? That's the most important thing, because that's the whole purpose of you going to B school. So that's so much so for the strategies for different audiences. I'm going to move on to a completely different topic and talk about some other factors that you need to keep in mind in general when selecting these schools, when applying to schools, etc. And these are things that most people don't really think of, right? So, for example, people plan to apply to US and European schools around the same time and get as many applications out as early as possible. For someone, applying to Oxford may be a safe school. But you have to understand that European schools ask for 10% of your tuition fee as a deposit, versus most US schools which have only about $1,000 or $2,000 deposit. Now, why is this important? Because the Oxford deadline, at least last year, was in September. Decisions came by November. The deposit date was even before any of the US school decisions were released. So that really puts a candidate in an uncomfortable position. Do they commit to the school? Do they let go of the opportunity? Do they ask for more time, which the school is not obliged to give? So would you want to get a decision from your number 4, number 5 choice early and pay a deposit at that school before even hearing back from your preferred schools? So that's something to keep in mind. Most of the European schools ask for 10% of your tuition fee as a deposit. London Business School is one of the few schools which doesn't. So if you're applying to London Business School along with US business schools in round 1, that's absolutely fine. But when you're applying to some of the other, whether it's in Oxford, Cambridge, INSEAD, etc., these are things you need to keep in mind as well. For most of the European schools, I would say try and apply early, especially for an Oxford, Cambridge, INSEAD. So INSEAD, you'll be at a huge advantage if you apply in round 1, round 2. Generally, I know the school says that applying across rounds, whether round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4 is same. It's not, in my opinion, especially if your background is somewhat standard. If your background is very unique, then sure you can apply in later rounds, but otherwise apply in round 1, round 2 to an INSEAD. To an Oxford, last year there was no problem if you applied in round 1, round 2. However, to Cambridge, we noticed that Cambridge did not admit any Indians in round 2. I think they just filled their class with whoever applied in round 1 and there were no more seats available. I could be wrong, but this is the data that I got, right? So with select European schools apply early, a lot of them have multiple rounds, like 6 rounds, 7 rounds, 8 rounds. In those cases, applying in between also, you should not face too many challenges. But the most important takeaway when applying to European-based schools is make sure you're applying in the order of priority so you're not losing money in terms of deposits. Even for candidates applying to an ISB, for example, they tend to apply in round 1 to improve their chances of getting in, but then the deposit is pretty high as well. And you have to ask yourself, is there an amount that you're willing to forego? Should you get a decision from another school? So just be wary of this when you're applying and you're figuring out in what order you should apply to schools. Right? So the primary consideration is your willingness to forego a deposit for a better school at a later stage and what the amount of the deposit would be. Okay. Another factor to consider when applying is your interviewing skills. So this has got something to do with the strategies that you may want to consider. So someone who's particularly good at interviewing, perhaps it's good to apply to schools which have open interviews or where you have a pretty high chance of getting an interview call. So for example, Kellogg's tries and interviews as many candidates as they can. There's no guarantee that you are going to get an interview, but they definitely do try. And if you're a good interviewer, apply to schools like that, which offer an open interview, which try and guarantee as many uh, applicants interviews as well. If your interview skills are not particularly strong, then there are various things that you must do. I definitely would apply to a safe school early and a school where I'm going to get an interview call or an interview decision also pretty early, because no matter how many mock interviews you do, there is nothing like the real scene. So if you're on the actual interview stage and you bomb that as well, that's fine. You've actually got one round of interviewing under your belt. And then you get a lot more confidence when you get into your second interview. So if you're particularly not good at interviewing, you tend to get very nervous. You tend to get stage fright. And then consider this as a strategy. Yes, some of these strategies may require to apply to additional schools, but in the grander scheme of things, you'll emerge a stronger candidate. Sure. Another thing to consider when applying is the length and difficulty of applications, and then when you should be applying to some of those schools. And I generally tell candidates do not start with a difficult application. What do I mean by a difficult application? Applications where you have open-ended essay questions. What is an open-ended essay question? Harvard. Tell us anything that you want outside of your application form. So you could literally tell the school anything. How would you know what to tell the school? What you want to cover? What stories you want to sell? A lot of clients struggle with this. So what we actually tell our clients to do is apply to schools which have very targeted questions. What is short and long-term career goals? Why do you want to apply to this particular B school? What is your greatest leadership experience? What is your greatest achievement? Once you get experience of putting down your stories on paper, telling a story well, demonstrating your motivation to go to a particular B school, then you have story bank. You'll find it a lot easier to put your mind together and focus on particular stories which sell you better than others. So I would recommend applying to schools which have very targeted questions first before you touch any school which has open-ended essay questions like a Harvard, Stanford. Some candidates struggle with schools which have, again, different sorts of questions. For example, Duke has 25 random things about you, and there are not too many things that you've done outside of work, or you don't have too many other stories to tell. Are you a very quiet person who doesn't really communicate well? You may struggle with some of these, right? So get some stories under your belt before you tackle some of these. So start with prioritize your applications essentially. Start with easier applications, something more targeted and focused. And the second thing that you must do is when you start on applications, right? You know when your deadlines are going to be. Budget time for each and every application. Some school applications go through a lot quicker and some take more time. Some applications require a lot more introspection as well. You'll get a sense of that when you're reviewing essay questions of different schools. So for a Kellogg, for example, set aside 4 weeks. If you're doing a Ross or a second or third application, I think about 2 weeks should be more than enough. European schools, each application is pretty lengthy. So your first application will take roughly about 4 weeks, and second and third maybe about 3 weeks each. Don't try and rush applications and finish them in 2 days. Everything is possible. Whether you do a quality job of that or no is a different thing altogether, right? So plan your time accordingly and apply when your candidacy is strongest. Okay. Another question that I'm constantly asked, and I always find people rushing in to apply in round one versus round two. So let's shed some light on round one and versus round two and the key differences out here as well. So the question is, in general, I would say apply when your candidacy is strongest. Definitely not in round three for the US schools. Round one, round two should be fine. If your candidacy is going to be stronger in round two versus round one, apply in round two. So a lot of people who are still to take the GMAT or GRE or considering retaking the GMAT or GRE, yes, more seats available in round one. And yes, applying early action, early decision, rolling admission, etc., you're a huge advantage. Also, at schools which have a smaller class size, like a Berkeley House, like a Yale, etc., you'll be at a huge advantage if you apply in round one. However, let's say you're applying to a school with a GMAT score of 710, and round three is going to apply to that particular school with a GMAT score of 740. You're a much stronger candidate with a GMAT score of 740 than with the 710. So definitely, I would, rather than applying to a school where I may risk being rejected, I would probably save my application for round two. If I'm considering applying for scholarships, you will always be at an advantage if you have a stronger candidacy rather than applying early, though more funds are available in earlier rounds. So the temptation may be to put in an application in an earlier round. But I think if you are applying in the earlier round, you need to see how far off you are from the class average. If you're pretty far off, or you come from a demographic where the average GMAT score is pretty high compared to the class average, then perhaps don't apply in round one. Apply when your candidacy is strongest. See, you're going to do MBA once in your life, right? There's a possibility also that you'll only apply to some of these schools once. You may not reapply the following year. So in which case, you'd rather apply when your candidacy is at its very strongest. Okay. Coming to the topic of test waivers. So in general, some schools do offer test waivers, and I would say someone who has a relatively low GRE GMAT score may consider applying for a test waiver. Don't be lazy about it. Just because you have a CFA, 3 years of experience with quant subjects, etc., you don't have the time to take the GMAT. I don't think that should be an excuse to not take the GMAT or GRE. I think schools find it easier to evaluate candidates if they have a GRE or GMAT score. Also, bear in mind that a lot of recruiters do look at GRE and GMAT scores. Most consulting firms will call you to an assessment center if you have anything over 700. In my experience, anyone with a 690 or below will not be invited to the assessment centers. I'm talking about the traditional GMAT and not the GMAT focus. So taking the GMAT, having a GMAT score is actually an advantage, and it helps. But if you have a really low score, like I explained, or like I mentioned earlier, I had a candidate who had a GRE score of 309. A score just simply wouldn't get into the school that she was targeting. That was a Rice, NYU, Emory, etc. There's no way that she was going to get into a school with those scores. So in that case, we actually requested for a GMAT waiver, and the other school was USC Marshall. So we actually requested for a GRE or GMAT waiver, and we got that. Obviously, to get that waiver, most schools would require you to have a strong academic record, either a certain professional qualification like a CFA, CPA, to demonstrate quantitative abilities to some form or the other, right? So those are things that you need to consider. But don't be lazy about taking the test. If you have a score of about 690, should you ask for a test waiver? Question mark, that really depends upon which school you're applying to. But see, we've also noticed that a lot of schools give out test waivers, but they find it very difficult to make a decision on a candidacy as such. And we find that not too many people with test waivers make it to some of the top schools. So at most of the top schools, you want to apply with a GRE and GMAT score. Okay. On a completely different topic, factors to consider when selecting B schools. And why am I talking about this today? Because whenever I have conversations with people applying to schools, the first thing that and the only thing that they look at is FT rankings, and they don't look at anything else. And my first suggestion to them would be look beyond rankings. There are lots of great schools out there, and they're patronized by different recruiters. And that's some of the things that I tend to encourage. Look at the recruiters list before looking at rankings, right? So some of the things that I would look at is just generally the reputation of the school. If you've never heard of a school prior to looking at the FT rankings, maybe that's something for you to think about. The US, for example, is over 2,000 business schools. In Europe, also the hundreds of schools as well. Even in India, a lot of people then look at only IIM and ISB, etc. But traditionally, also there were some great schools like an NMIMS, a Bajaj, etc., which are patronized by certain recruiters. For example, if I want to make it to a Unilever or a Colgate, I might find it easier to get a job and a placement through an NMIMS or a Jamnalal Bajaj than through an ISB. So look at where do your recruiters go and recruit from. So definitely consider the reputation of the school, access to recruiters, strength in a particular area, faculty, facilities out there. So what I mean by facilities and faculty, right? So for example, if you want to be in finance and you want to study value investing, then you've heard of Ashwath Damodaran. You know he teaches at NYU, and he may be a great motivation to go and study and learn from. If you want to be an asset manager, some schools like a Vanderbilt, Darden have their own fund, which will give you fund management experience if you're part of that particular program. So those are possible things to consider as well, right? Depending upon your career and the facilities that the schools offer. So different schools will have strengths in different areas. Location. Again, location becomes a personal choice. If you want to build stronger connections with your classmates, then being a slightly more remote location will definitely allow that because there's not much other distraction. But if you're someone who's not so great at networking, I would definitely recommend being in a big city. It gives you far more networking opportunity than anything else. Also consider being the proximity to recruiters. So for example, if you want to work in tech, but you want to study in Boston, not really the best area and location to get access to those sort of recruiters, right? Similarly, if you want to be in finance, it pays to be in a financial center than being very far away from it. On the subject of location, we also need to look at work permit laws of different countries. Today, some countries are becoming particularly more challenging, particularly harsh on immigrants, and making work permit laws far more challenged to get. Whereas in some countries, there are reciprocal arrangements as well. So India and France now have a bilateral agreement where students can stay back and work in France and stay for 5 years. Obviously, depending on certain conditions, but that may also require you to learn the local language. We have a similar tie-up with Germany as well. The UK, on the other hand, has been, at least the current government, has been trying to make work permit laws more challenging. So before you apply to any particular country, rather than assuming you're going to get a job in any particular country, please research the work permit laws. The other thing I would always say is study in the area or the country you want to work in. If you want to work in London, study in and around London. If you want to study, be based in the UK, I see no point of you studying in Spain or Italy, etc. Firstly, why will a recruiter come all the way to that particular country to recruit? And secondly, how will you get a work permit a work permit for the UK? So these are factors which a lot of people have not considered, and I definitely would say consider some of these factors before applying. And there are lots of other things that you could look at as well. The program duration, the school culture. Again, what I mean by school culture. If I'm an aspiring entrepreneur, a lot of schools are actually preparing candidates for jobs and not really to become risk takers, not really to start up a business. Some of them don't have incubators. Some of them don't have access to great mentors. So you really need to look at the culture of the school. If you're applying to European B schools or Asian B schools and you're not sure of the ranking of the particular school, what it means to look at a good way of identifying the strength of the school will be looking at their exchange partners. If you see that you're getting access to some of the top global business schools through exchange, so for example, through an IM, you're getting access to go to a Chicago booth or a Wharton or London Business School, etc., then you know you're in good company. If you're getting access to tier two or tier three schools through exchange, then that also gives you an indication on the strength of that particular program as well. So these are just some of the criteria you can use for selecting these schools beyond rankings. For me, rankings don't mean anything. They are just a good read. What they conceal is far more important than what they reveal. Okay. Moving on to a completely different topic. How do I manage recommendations and what should I do with recommendations? Who should write my recommendations, etc. So in general, we see the candidates tend to prefer people who have a uh, larger designation or a more senior in terms of designation. But we would say that choose people who know you better rather than someone who's just a CEO or very senior in your company and can't really speak on your candidacy. The second thing I would say is recommendations take time. Recommenders also sometimes have never done this before, so sound them out in advance. Make points, remind them of your achievements, ask them to put things in perspective, right? Put in a comparison, compare your performance versus others. But obviously, when they're making those comparisons, the other people shouldn't come out as stronger people than you. So choose recommenders as well who are going to sell you and do a good job of selling you rather than someone who may not do such a great job of selling you as well. And give them as much time. Now, let's say you're from a family business, then perhaps you should reach out to clients for a recommendation. Uh, Maybe you have an investor, maybe you reach out to them. Getting an application, getting a recommendation from a parent, etc., I mean, it's not really advisable. So these are some of the things that we would talk about when talking about recommenders. Who should write your recommenders? Who should write your recommendations? Um, I'm going to try and go through some of the other questions out here on the chat and try and address them as well. Is there a preference for GMAT versus GRE? So honestly, a few years ago, there was a slight preference for GMAT. Most of the people who applied with the GRE essentially were people who did not perform well on the GMAT. But since there was no history out there, schools were a little bit more forgiving when it came to accepting GRE scores. Now, when you actually go and compare, since schools have been applying and accepting GRE scores for a number of years, the average GRE scores also increased a lot. So you will actually see the breakup of a quantum verbal score on the GRE as 160, 160 in most business schools. But the average GRE score in most business schools will be a lot higher. So by and large, if you're applying to top 10, top 15 school, as a female candidate, you may want to be in the range of about 326, 328, at least at the bare minimum. Anything below that could be somewhat challenging. At schools between, say, 30 and 15 rankings, anything in the 320 range should be more or less okay on the GRE. Right? But the average GRE scores have also increased. And I think today there's no more difference between GMAT and GRE, which also brings me to the point of GMAT focus versus GMAT regular. Last year, certain schools like a Harvard did not accept the GMAT focus edition. This year, I think that they don't have a choice, and a lot of schools will look at all. But since there's no real standard set as such, they're going to look at the percentiles and they're going to look at conversion tables, etc. And I think a good base will be having a 740 on the traditional GMAT as the bare minimum for an Indian male candidate. Otherwise, you won't be at least the class average. Let's take the next question. How can I make my application compared to undergrad going straight after undergrad this year? Okay, I think if you're applying as an undergrad, first you'll be applying for different MBA programs, or the 2+2. And I think the idea is you have to focus on what's really selling you. So the first thing is it's assumed that you have a very strong academic record, that you would have a strong GMAT or GRE score. Now, most MBA programs, what are they recruiting for? They're recruiting for potential leaders. So you definitely need to demonstrate leadership potential and wherever and your leadership experience. So you need to show a lot of put a lot of focus on your leadership experience, right? Beyond only internship, you may have been very involved in the community. You may have participated in lots of other activities as well. Sell that and demonstrate your leadership experience. If you're applying for 2+2, I actually think it's more beneficial to a school than to a candidate because schools can lock in exceptional talent very early. So, for example, Darden has a deferred MBA program, whereas perhaps, and with no respect to Darden, perhaps you could have applied to a more competitive school 3 or 4 years down the line if you spend time building your profile. So if you are applying to any deferred MBA programs, there should be good reason for it as well. If you're getting access to a great brand, definitely do it. But be careful about which brands you're applying to. We'll move on and take the next question. Okay. Coming from a design background is not a positive or a negative, and that's not a bad thing at all. A lot of schools look at diversity. What schools look at is the impact of your work on an organization, and they're looking at leadership potential as well. And those are things that you need to highlight. If you have gaps, I think it just makes sense to explain those gaps. A lot of people have gaps in the last couple of years. People have been put out of work because of COVID and found it difficult to get a job. People have their employment has been deferred again because of COVID. So lots of other questions as well. The important thing is what did you do in that time? And try and show how you've utilized the time fruitfully to better sell yourself, right? But I think this becomes a case-to-case basis. So I don't think this should affect your profile too badly. And again, I think coming from a design background is not a disadvantage. It could be an advantage as well. You need to show the impact of your work, and you need to show your leadership experience. Sorry, your leadership potential. Let's take the next question. Which schools you consider older candidate friendly? Okay, perfect. Okay, so 1-year programs, especially in the US, will be older candidate friendly. So, for example, Kellogg has the MBA the Kellogg has a 1-year program. They also have the MBA program as well, which looks for people with certain number of years of experience in technology or in the technology industry. So those will be schools which prefer older candidates. Some of the European schools like London Business School, etc., don't mind older candidates as well. Today, if you're applying to an INSEAD, if you have 10 years or less work experience, you're absolutely fine. Oxford, etc., you're fine. If you're applying to some of the European schools, Tuck, Duke, Columbia, all don't mind candidates with with more experience. If you have more than 10 years of experience, there are certain other programs like the MIT Sloan Leadership Program, the London Business School Sloan Leadership Program, and the Stanford MSX. Those are 3 other schools. You could also look at the USC Marshall 1-year program as well, the IBER, and that tends to have people with minimum 6 years experience, on average about 12 to 14 years of experience. So those are schools that you could consider. If your question was about the 2-year programs, like I said, on the more ambitious side, you have programs like Duke, Tuck, Columbia, Foster, Rice, or some of the other programs outside of the top 20. Next question, please.
Vikram, I would just like to remind you and the audience that we are coming up on time. We have about a minute left on this session.
So fair enough. So what I would request is then let's not take any more questions. I will make a note of most of these. I will try and answer these individually and ping answers to candidates separately. Otherwise, candidates welcome to stay back and join me in my booth. Or candidates can email me separately and on my email address here in the booth or on my email address, which is mba@vikramshah.com. And I'm happy to interact with you through the rest of the event today, tomorrow, or even post the event. I hope you found the session useful. Some feedback on this would be great. Thank you guys so much for attending and giving me the opportunity to talk to you and clear some of your doubts as well. Thank you guys.